The sky hung heavy with storm clouds as dusk fell over the dry Wyoming plains, the wind carrying a strange tension that made even the insects fall quiet. An old dog, his muzzle dusted with gray and his body stiff from time, stood atop a hill just beyond the ranch house. His ears twitched at a sound, distant, indistinct, but somehow familiar. He stood motionless, tail low, eyes fixed on the far edge of the horizon, where the land bled into the clouds. The sound came again, the faint echo of hooves on hard-packed earth, too faint to be real, but real enough to stir something long buried. Rusty was a cattle dog by breed and a guardian by heart. He had known these lands his entire life, and they had known him. The creak of saddle leather, the bark of coyotes, the rustle of tumbleweeds, these sounds lived in his bones. But there was one sound he had not heard in years, and it called to him now. Not from memory, but from the earth itself. Years earlier, the ranch had been quiet when the call came in, a wild mare found dead near the cliffs, her foal still breathing beside her. Sarah, the ranch owner, didn't hesitate. She knew that Mustangs didn't belong in fences, but she also knew that sometimes, survival demanded things that didn't make sense. When they brought the foal in, it was barely clinging to life. Skeletal, muddied, its eyes too large for its head and filled with a hollow kind of fear. Sarah placed it in the hay, wrapped it in a blanket, and whispered to it as if it were a child lost in a storm. Rusty watched from the doorway, ears perked. He was cautious at first. He'd been raised to herd, not nurture. But that first night, when the wind howled like ghosts and the little foal cried out in a voice too broken for its size, Rusty slipped into the stall and lay beside it. The foal quieted, and from that moment on, something unspoken passed between them. Sarah named the foal Ash, after the gray flecks that dotted his coat, like embers left in a dying fire. Ash was too young to be wild, too weak to run. He stumbled more than he walked, but every time he fell, Rusty was there, nudging him gently with a cold nose, urging him up again. They became inseparable. At dawn, while the world was still chilled and gold, Rusty would bark, and Ash would totter after him like a shadow with legs. When it rained, they huddled beneath the overhang together, and when it thundered, Rusty would stand between Ash and the storm, unmoving, as if his aging body could defy the sky itself. Ash grew quickly. His legs lengthened, his chest widened, and his stride began to resemble the wildness that stirred within him. But he remained gentle with Rusty. Where he might kick in play with a goat or chase after the barn cat, he never dared run too fast when Rusty was near. He seemed to sense the limits of his friend, and respected them without being told. Sarah watched them often from the porch, coffee in hand, eyes wet with something between awe and ache. She knew it couldn't last forever. The wild, once tasted, never forgets its flavor. As Ash grew into himself, the tension between what he was and what he was meant to be began to show. He would linger longer at the fence line, eyes scanning the horizon like it whispered secrets he couldn't understand. He would paw the earth, snort at the wind, and turn circles in his stall at night. Sarah knew those signs. She had seen them before in other Mustangs, in the ones too spirited to be kept. Rusty sensed it too. He grew quieter, slower. He watched Ash with something between pride and mourning. His eyes were still sharp, but his body no longer moved with certainty. There were days when he didn't chase the squirrels, and nights when he slept too long without stirring. Then came the morning that changed everything. The sun hadn't yet risen, but the world was light enough to see. Sarah stepped out with her coffee, expecting the familiar sound of hooves and paws, but found only silence. The gate was open, the air was still, and Rusty sat alone beneath the cottonwood, eyes fixed on the distant ridge. Ash was gone. He hadn't broken out violently. There were no signs of panic, no damage. Just a trail of soft, deliberate hoofprints that led out into the wild, toward the place where fences ended and freedom began. Sarah didn't chase him. She never planned to. She just sat beside Rusty and whispered, "He's not ours anymore." But Rusty didn't seem to accept that. For weeks, he returned to the cottonwood every morning. He sat still, head high, nose lifted as if catching a scent no one else could. Some nights he would whimper softly in his sleep, legs twitching as if dreaming of chasing something long out of reach. And then, slowly, the days moved on. Seasons passed. Rusty aged. His eyes lost some of their fire. His bark became a rasp. But every so often, he would still make his way to the hill, that same one he stood on now. Even as the ranch life pulsed without Ash, Rusty seemed to carry his memory like a firefly trapped in a jar, dim but never extinguished. No one knew what had become of Ash. There were stories. Ranch hands would sometimes claim they'd seen a gray stallion running with the herds near the foothills, faster than the wind and twice as stubborn. They said he didn't lead the herd, but that the others followed him anyway. Sarah listened without saying much, though her hands would always tremble slightly on the reins when she rode those borders. And then tonight, that sound again. Rusty's body trembled, but he did not move. The air buzzed with anticipation. Sarah came up behind him, wrapped in a shawl, her eyes searching the distance. "There's nothing there, boy," she said softly, kneeling beside him. "Just the wind." But Rusty didn't blink, didn't twitch. And then, faint but certain, came the sound of hooves again. Real this time. From the far ridge, something moved. A silhouette in the dying light, tall and powerful, with a coat that shimmered silver beneath the darkening sky. It didn't come closer. It didn't call out. It simply stood, watching. Rusty let out a single bark, soft and low, the kind reserved for when someone returns home. Sarah narrowed her eyes, but by the time she turned fully to look, the shape was gone. Only dust remained. The wind picked up again, carrying with it a scent she hadn't smelled in years. Wild grass, rain-soaked soil, and something else. She looked down at Rusty, who still faced the ridge, his eyes moist but fierce. "You knew," she whispered. "You always knew." Rusty didn't reply. He simply lowered himself to the ground with a quiet groan, and rested his head on his paws. Out in the distance, the first stars began to pierce the veil of night, and somewhere beyond them, a Mustang ran, not just with the wind, but ahead of it. And something deep within Rusty's heart stirred again, like a fire catching in old wood. Not quite alive, but not quite ready to die. He closed his eyes. He was waiting. Ash's hooves struck the dry earth with a rhythm that belonged to the wild. No longer the trembling foal from the ranch, he moved with confidence, with purpose, with something ancient thrumming through his veins. The wind pressed into his face like an old friend and roared past his ears with a voice that said, "You're home." Behind him, the memories of hay-scented stalls, soft barks, and kind hands lingered like footprints in shallow mud. But Ash didn't look back. The herds found him before he found them. They were cautious, as wild horses are, watching from ridgelines and shadows as he wandered unfamiliar territory. He bore no scars, wore no brands. He was not one of them, and yet, he didn't run like the broken ones who escaped fences. He ran like he belonged. And eventually they accepted him, not with fanfare, but with space. Space to drink. Space to eat. Space to run beside them. In time, Ash became a whisper on the wind. Locals spoke of a silver-coated stallion who appeared at dawn, leading no herd but always running at its edge. They said he could outrun storms, that no predator dared follow him. Ash didn't lead with dominance. He didn't bite or kick for rank. He led because the wild recognized something in him, a fire that refused to die, a silence that spoke louder than screams. But freedom, while beautiful, came at a price. Winter was harsh that year. The kind that crept beneath skin and bone and waited for the weak to collapse. The Mustangs huddled together against the wind, eyes squinting into white nothingness. Food was scarce. Water froze solid. One by one, the older horses fell behind. Ash didn't falter. His body had grown powerful, lean with muscle forged from miles of endless galloping. He became a guide in the storm, nudging yearlings to their feet, pressing against mares with foals to keep them moving. Yet at night, when the herd finally paused to rest, Ash would stand alone on the ridge, staring at the stars. They reminded him of Rusty, how the old dog used to gaze skyward, nose twitching at scents only he could understand. The night was no longer quiet to Ash, it was filled with whispers from a world he had left behind. A part of him wondered if Rusty still waited at the cottonwood tree or if the wind had carried him elsewhere. Back at the ranch, the seasons turned without pause. Sarah aged like the land, slowly, unyieldingly. Her hands became rougher, her movements slower, but her spirit remained anchored. And Rusty, he aged too. His once smooth gait had become a stiff shuffle. His eyes grew clouded, but his ears remained alert, as though still listening for hooves that never came. He spent more time lying beneath the cottonwood now, head resting on his paws, body curled to hold what little warmth the earth offered. Sometimes Sarah sat beside him and read aloud from old ranch ledgers. Other times, she simply stroked his coat and said nothing at all. But he still waited. Then one night the wind shifted. It came from the west, carrying a dry, smoky taste. The sky turned orange at its edges. Sarah stood on the porch, squinting at the unnatural glow. She'd lived through prairie fires before, and the signs were unmistakable. She moved quickly, gathering what she could, alerting neighbors, securing the stables. The fire wasn't close yet, but it was coming. Rusty watched her with unease, sensing the panic in her movements, feeling the change in the ground beneath his paws. That night, he didn't sleep. He paced, restless and agitated, as if something inside him was pulling, urging. At first light, the world smelled of ash. Sarah loaded animals into trailers, sweat beading on her brow. The fire had jumped a ridge overnight. It was now less than 10 miles away. In the chaos, no one noticed when Rusty slipped away. He didn't run. He couldn't. But he moved with stubborn determination, dragging his tired legs toward the ridge where he and Ash had once stood together. The smoke was thick, curling around the base of the hills like a warning. But Rusty kept going, nose low, ears pinned, following something invisible but undeniable. The fire wasn't the only threat. Wild predators, pushed out by the flames, skulked closer to human land. The balance was crumbling. Deer ran blindly. Coyotes howled in midday. Even birds circled lower than usual, sensing something was terribly wrong. And out there, alone, Ash watched. From a distance, he saw the smoke trail splitting across the land like a scar. He didn't understand human maps or fire forecasts, but instinct screamed at him. The earth beneath his hooves was too hot, the air too dry. He had seen fire before, a small one that devoured a grove in the south, but this was different. This was death. The herd began to move, uneasy and reluctant. Ash drove them faster, ears flicking back, nostrils flared. But halfway across the plain, something made him stop. A sound, quiet, hoarse, ragged. A bark. He turned. The wind howled again. Silence followed. And then he saw it. Far behind him, beyond the tall grasses and near a line of scorched brush, a figure moved. Limping. Stumbling. Rusty. Ash stood frozen for a breath too long. The world shrank to a single point, the trembling shape of the dog who had once guarded him through storms, who had once given him warmth when he had nothing else. Smoke thickened. The ground vibrated faintly beneath his hooves. The herd was moving east. The fire was pushing west. But Rusty, he was going to be caught in the middle. Ash ran. His body moved like it remembered the ranch days, the tight corners, the fast turns, the way Rusty used to dodge and dance around him. Now it was Ash's turn. He charged downhill, kicking up dust and sparks, a silver blur against the smoke-drenched sky. He reached Rusty just as the dog collapsed from exhaustion. Ash reared back and snorted, lowering his head. He nudged Rusty gently, once, twice. The dog blinked up at him, tongue dry, eyes full of something like disbelief and relief. Ash bent lower. Rusty, with a final surge of effort, clambered onto his back. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. Carrying Rusty, Ash turned and galloped back toward the thinning herd. Flames crept across the far hills. Trees cracked like bones. Ash's legs pumped harder, faster. He could feel Rusty's body shifting slightly with each stride, but the dog held on, barely. Ahead, a break in the smoke. A narrow path, barely wide enough. Ash didn't hesitate. He plunged through, lungs burning, vision blurred. The air around him roared like a living thing, trying to swallow him whole. But he ran anyway. For Rusty. For the cottonwood. For every moment they had shared under moonlight and thunder. Finally, the fire thinned. The smoke gave way to light. And then, open space. Ash emerged on the far side, heaving, sides slick with sweat, Rusty clinging to life on his back. Sarah, standing at the edge of the field, dropped the bucket in her hand. For a moment time froze. Then she ran. Ash slowed only when she reached him. Rusty lifted his head weakly, tail giving a faint wag. Sarah scooped him into her arms, eyes brimming with tears, whispering his name over and over. Ash stood still. His legs trembled. Smoke curled from his mane. But his eyes never left face. And as the wind blew across the charred land behind them, carrying with it the scent of soot and salvation, Ash turned once more toward the hills. This time, he didn't run for freedom. He ran for home. Ash didn't return to the herd after that. He lingered at the edge of the ranch, just beyond the fields, where the wild grasses still swayed in untouched rhythms. He watched from the shadows of cottonwoods, hidden but ever present. Something in him had shifted. The fire had taken more than land. It had burned away the line between who he had become and who he had been. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was running away. He was watching over something. Someone. Rusty recovered slowly. The fire had left him weak, lungs raw from smoke, legs stiffened by strain. Sarah cared for him like he was the only thing in the world that mattered. She set up a cot beside the hearth and refused to leave his side for days. Her voice, cracked with worry, softened with each passing hour as his tail began to thump faintly again, as his breathing grew steadier. But even as he healed, his eyes always drifted to the window. He would stare into the dusk, watching the tree line where shadow and grass met. Sarah noticed. She'd catch him lifting his head, ears twitching, as if hearing something just outside the reach of her senses. Once, she opened the door and peered into the dark, half expecting to see Ash standing there. But there was nothing. Only silence and the rustle of leaves. Weeks passed, and life began to mend its edges. The charred fields sprouted green again, tentative at first, then vibrant and bold. The air no longer smelled of ash but of earth reborn. Calves were born, fences rebuilt, routines resumed. Yet a subtle hum of anticipation hung in the air, like a breath held too long. One morning, Sarah found hoofprints near the edge of the field, fresh, deep, and deliberate. They didn't meander or circle. They pointed straight toward the barn, then away. A single pass. A visit, not a return. She didn't mention it to anyone. She simply walked the fence line more often. Left the gate unlatched. Filled the old water trough even though it hadn't been used in years. That same week, Rusty ventured outside for the first time since the fire. His steps were slow, but his tail wagged with stubborn pride. He made his way to the cottonwood, sat at its base, and looked out toward the hills. Sarah brought a blanket and laid it beside him. They stayed there until the sun dipped low and the wind carried a familiar scent, one that made Rusty's ears perk and his nose twitch with longing. Ash appeared just before dusk. He emerged from the trees like a ghost from a memory, taller, more powerful, mane tangled from the wind, but unmistakably him. He didn't come close, not yet. He stood still, watching, as if seeking permission from the land itself. Rusty barked once, low, hoarse, full of memory and welcome. Sarah stood, heart pounding. She didn't move toward him. She knew better. She simply whispered, "You came back." Ash stepped forward, slow and deliberate. His eyes locked with Sarah's for a brief moment, and in them she saw the foal she had cradled in blankets, the yearling who had chased shadows, the stallion who had vanished into legend. But now, he wasn't just a memory returned. He was something more. Something bigger than the land he had run across. That night, Ash stayed just beyond the fence. Sarah left the barn door open, just in case. In the morning, the hay had been eaten and the trough empty. No one spoke of it aloud, but they all knew. He was back. Yet Ash didn't remain within the fences. He never slept in the stalls or lingered in the paddock. He came and went like the wind, untouchable and ever-present. Rusty always knew when Ash was near. His ears would perk moments before Ash appeared at the edge of the field, and his eyes would follow him long after he'd disappeared. They resumed their silent routine, two old friends connected by something deeper than words. Ash would graze within sight of the ranch, and Rusty would sit nearby, head tilted slightly, as if hearing stories only Ash could tell. But peace, as always, was fragile. One evening, a truck arrived at the ranch, stirring dust and unease. It belonged to a developer, a man with sharp boots and sharper eyes, who spoke in clipped tones about land rights and investment opportunities. He gestured broadly at the fields, mentioned things like expansion and revenue potential, and left a folder with maps and numbers too large to ignore. Sarah didn't even open it. "I'm not selling," she said, her voice flat. The man smirked, as if he'd heard that 1,000 times. "Everything's for sale. Sooner or later." That night, Sarah sat on the porch longer than usual, staring out at the darkening hills. Rusty lay at her feet, breathing slow and steady. She didn't speak, but her hand gripped the railing tightly, knuckles white against the wood. Ash was watching from the ridge. Days passed, but the pressure didn't ease. The man returned, each time with more urgency, more paperwork, more veiled threats. The nearby landowners had begun to sell. One by one, plots disappeared, fences came down, machines moved in. The herd Ash once ran with was spotted farther south, displaced, thinner than before. One morning, Ash didn't appear. Not at the edge of the field. Not by the creek. Not even at night when the moon hung low like a watchful eye. Rusty waited at the cottonwood, ears drooped, unmoving. Days passed. A week. 2. Sarah worried, though she said nothing aloud. Then, in the dead of night, a sound shattered the stillness, the high-pitched, panicked whinny of a horse. Sarah leapt from bed, heart hammering. Rusty was already at the door, barking frantically. She followed the sound into the field, flashlights sweeping over the grass. What she saw froze her blood. Ash, his coat slick with sweat and streaked with cuts, stood between a mare and two panicked foals. Beyond them, just inside the newly sold property line, a trench had been dug, deep, cruel, and hidden by weeds. The mare had fallen in, struggling, legs bloodied. One of the foals had already slipped in partially, screaming. Ash was trying to shield them all, circling, snorting, biting at the air. Sarah acted without thinking. She called the ranch hands, fetched ropes, climbed into the trench, and coaxed the mare out inch by inch. Ash didn't leave their side. He remained until the last foal was lifted, his eyes never straying, his body trembling not from fear, but fury. By dawn, the trench was filled in. Sarah made calls, angry, determined. She filed complaints, filed reports, fought back. Word spread. The community rallied. Old ranchers who hadn't spoken in years stood beside her. They remembered what the land meant, what the wild meant. They remembered Ash. They remembered Rusty. And they refused to let the land be bought and buried beneath concrete and greed. The developers backed off, slowly and reluctantly. But something had changed. Ash stayed closer now. Not just to protect, but to belong. He began to walk beside Rusty again, their silhouettes reunited at sunset like shadows from a forgotten dream. Sarah watched them from the porch, heart full, voice quiet. The cottonwood stood taller somehow, as if strengthened by their return. And though Ash still vanished into the hills sometimes, he always came back. Not because he had to. Because he chose to. The first snowfall came early that year. It fell silently overnight, blanketing the ranch in a soft hush that erased every hoofprint, every scar on the earth. When Sarah opened the door that morning, the air was sharp and clean, the horizon a sea of white undisturbed by even the wind. She stood in the threshold for a moment, coffee in hand, eyes scanning the hills beyond the field. There was no movement, no sign of Ash, but she knew he was near. He always was now. Rusty sat beside her, older now, slower in his steps, but his spirit burned no less brightly. The silver around his muzzle had spread, and his bark had softened to a raspy growl, but his eyes still shone with that same eager fire. He looked toward the cottonwood tree, and wagged his tail slowly, as though expecting Ash to appear at any moment from the whiteness. And eventually he did. Ash came down from the hills just after midday, his dark coat powdered with snow, eyes alert and wild as ever, yet softer now around the edges. He stepped carefully, reverently, like the snow beneath his hooves was sacred. Sarah watched from the barn, heart still catching in her chest each time she saw him. Even after everything, he still felt like a miracle. As Ash reached the pasture, Rusty barked once and trotted forward, slower than before but determined. Ash lowered his head, a familiar greeting, and the two stood together in the snow, their breath mingling in clouds, their bodies still and content. Time hadn't dulled the bond between them. If anything, it had deepened it. Winter settled over the land like a lullaby. The ranch moved slower, quieter. Fewer chores, longer nights. Sarah found herself sitting by the fire more often, journals open in her lap, half filled with stories she couldn't yet tell. Not because they weren't ready, but because she wasn't sure anyone would believe them. A wild Mustang who never forgot. A dog who loved with such loyalty he risked his life for a friend. A ranch saved not by money or power, but by memory and heart. Ash stayed closer that season, lingering in the paddock at night, sometimes even stepping into the barn. Not into a stall, never behind a gate, but into the open aisle where he could see the stars through the slats and feel the wind on his back. He would sleep standing beside Rusty, their breathing in sync, their dreams a shared language. But with the quiet came a shadow. Rusty's legs began to falter. At first, it was subtle, a misstep here, a stumble there. Then came the mornings where he didn't rise right away, where his food sat untouched until midday. Sarah tried everything. Vitamins, medicine, extra warmth, vet visit. But some things time claims slowly, kindly, like a gentle tide pulling back. Rusty didn't suffer. He simply slowed. He still followed Ash when he could, still barked when the wind shifted, still wagged his tail when Sarah whispered his name. But he tired faster. Slept longer. Ash noticed. He became more watchful, more present. He began to nudge Rusty gently, walking slower to match his pace. He no longer wandered far from the barn. He was always near, as if standing guard against the inevitable. One morning, just before the new year, Rusty didn't rise. Sarah found him nestled in his favorite corner of the barn, head resting on his paws, breathing shallow. His eyes opened when she knelt beside him, and he gave her a soft, slow wag of his tail. Ash stood just outside, still as stone, eyes locked on the scene with an intensity that went beyond understanding. Sarah rested her hand on Rusty's head and whispered, voice cracking, "You don't have to hold on anymore." Rusty blinked slowly, then turned his head slightly, just enough to see Ash through the open barn door. The two stared at each other for a long time, no sound, no movement. Just the quiet, sacred exchange between souls who had lived a lifetime in each other's presence. And then, with a final breath that sighed like wind through trees, Rusty was gone. Sarah wept quietly, her hands trembling as she stroked his fur. Ash didn't move for a long time. When he did, he stepped forward slowly, reverently, and lowered his head to nuzzle Rusty's still form. He lingered there, breathing in the scent of the one who had once shared his fear, his joy, his very first steps. That night, Sarah buried Rusty beneath the cottonwood, beside the rock where he had spent his days watching the hills. Ash stayed at the edge of the field, unmoving, as the wind swept snow over the fresh earth. Sarah lit a lantern and left it glowing through the night, a beacon of love, of memory, of things too beautiful to be forgotten. After Rusty passed, something in Ash changed. He didn't leave the ranch anymore. Not fully. He still roamed the hills during the day, but by dusk, he always returned, standing beneath the cottonwood like a sentinel. His eyes watched the wind, the stars, the place where his friend now slept. Sarah worried that he would drift again, that grief would carry him back to the wild. But he didn't. He remained. Not just as a shadow, but as a presence. He let her brush him now, slowly, cautiously. He took apples from her hand. One day, he even stepped fully into the barn, standing beneath the beams where the light pooled warmest. Spring arrived, gentle and green. Flowers bloomed near the cottonwood, a quiet tribute to Rusty's resting place. The ranch was alive with new energy, foals were born, laughter returned. And Ash was there for all of it. He stood with the colts at the fence, watched over the new life like a guardian from a story half remembered. One morning, a boy from the neighboring ranch approached the fence, wide-eyed, pointing at Ash. "That's him, isn't it? The wild one with the dog." Sarah smiled, eyes soft. "That's him." The story spread, as stories like this do. People came to see Ash, not as a legend, but as something more meaningful. A symbol of what can be healed, of bonds unbroken by time or tragedy. Children would sit beneath the cottonwood, whispering tales about the Mustang who loved a dog more than freedom. Artists painted murals. Writers penned poems. Ash didn't seem to mind the attention. He remained himself, quiet, dignified, free in all the ways that mattered. He would approach when he chose to, retreat when he needed space. But he was always there. Always watching. Years passed. The ranch grew. Ash aged gracefully, his strength undiminished, his gaze wiser. Sometimes, on misty mornings, Sarah would walk the fields and see him standing in the dawn light, mane blowing in the breeze, eyes fixed on something unseen. She liked to think he still saw Rusty sometimes, that in the wind, in the rustling of the cottonwood leaves, their story continued. And then, one summer evening, as the sky burned gold and orange, Sarah saw something that made her heart stop. Ash stood in the field, as usual, but he wasn't alone. Beside him stood a small, trembling foal, scrawny, with knobby knees and wide eyes. No mother in sight. No trail to follow. Ash looked at Sarah, then back at the foal, and stepped aside, as if offering him to the world. Sarah walked forward, tears stinging her eyes. The foal didn't bolt. He watched her warily, then turned back to Ash, who gave the gentlest nudge forward. And just like that, the circle began again. Ash had brought back more than memories. He had brought hope. He had brought the next chapter. And in the soft hush of the wind, through the whispering trees and sunlit pastures, the ranch lived on, carrying the legacy of a wild Mustang, a loyal dog, and the bond that changed everything.